Well, I want to welcome you all here for the second lecture in this series for the 2017-2018 academic year, sponsored by the Institute for the Study of Western Civilization. And of course, one of the interesting things about the West is its effort to take that which is so often a matter of myth and legend and try to put it into what we call a scientific context, a context built on evidence and on reason. This is, of course, now a worldwide project. It's not only Western, but this grew up in the West, and as it grew, it created all sorts of upheavals because it disrupted not only established ways of thinking, but ways of thinking that were terribly important for the social and psychological stability of the people who lived in the West and presumably now all around the world. About 30 or 40 years ago, perhaps in some sense, trying to be more like the scientific parts of the university, our English departments took a theoretical turn. This was a turn toward the kind of theory that might mystify the average scientist, but nonetheless, I think, involved a kind of yearning to be more part of that great project that science had carved out for itself within the West, the project of clarifying, but at the same time, in troubling ways, disenchanting. I don't know how many of those theoretical approaches are going to have a big payoff, but I do think there's one that has genuine promise, and it's kind of the odd man out, because rather than turning against the notions of objectivity and of assessing the nature of a real world, it takes literature, one of those great forms of human imagination that for a long time were thought to be resistant to deep, probing, rational analysis, and tries to understand it in terms of one of the great paradigms of modern science, that is to say Darwinianism or evolutionary theory. I can say, and I think in some sense more is the pity, that it has taken our English departments by storm, but it certainly has found followers within them, a hardy band who kind of stand up against the dominant worldviews and try to make, in pioneering and often very interesting ways, sense of literature from this paradigm of science. And we have a man who is generally one of its leading exponents in the United States, someone whose work I've known about for a very long time. It's a subject that interests me. Joseph Carroll. Dr. Carroll is curator professor at the University of Missouri, St. Louis, and the author of a series of works that probe literature from a Darwinian perspective and often have the name of the great iconic figure in their title. For example, among the books he's produced are Literary Darwinism, most recently a book called Darwin's Bridge, Uniting the Sciences and the Humanities, and other types of titles which bear similar import, Reading Human Nature, Graphing Jane Austen, rather not grasping her, but graphing her. He's also the editor of a publication that tries to pull all of this together called Evolution and the Literary Imagination. Now, he knows a great deal about traditional literary history. He has written, apart from those books, important works on the American poet Wallace Stevens and the British poet and writer Matthew Arnold. who was certainly troubled by the science of his time and what it was doing to those things that he had thought before that was so firm and well-established and comforting. So he's an interesting combination of types, a student of literature and a student of evolutionary science who is trying to combine the two. And so, with that introduction, let me turn the floor over to Dr. Joseph Carroll.
The Truth About Fiction, Biological Reality, and Imaginary Lives. This is the basis of a book I've been working on. It's a course I'm teaching at the present time. The idea is to put two things together: biological reality, meaning the basic animal realities of human existence, and the imagination, arguing that all of our imaginative products are deeply imbued with biological realities, and that one of the biological realities of human life is the imagination, that we're a peculiarly imaginative species. The main thesis of the course I've been teaching is that the central themes of human life are also the central themes of fiction, and that they're based on the human life cycle. Every species has a life cycle. It's a reproductive cycle. There's a whole field of biology called life history theory, which studies the life course, the forms of reproduction, mating, parenting, if there is parenting, length of childhood, senescence, longevity, and they're different for different species. And the human species has developed one that's has some similarities to all mammals, some similarities to other primates and to apes, but that also has features that are unique to the human species. And I'll talk some about that as we go along. The human life cycle is regulated by reproductive needs. People are born, they grow up, they have sex, babies are produced. Humans are oriented, geared towards a family structure, pair-bonded dual parenting, embedded in a community, and then they grow old and die, and it all goes over again. Humans are social animals, so that all these basic biological realities like sex and survival and birth and old age and death take place for humans within a social context. There's in all known societies, there's a distinction between the private individual person and the social persona, but there are very few humans, have ever been very few humans anywhere in the world who are completely isolated. People need other people. So the central themes of human life are these: survival, growing up, sex and love, family, community, aliens and enemies, and the life of the mind. This is, if you pick up a textbook of evolutionary psychology, you'll see chapters devoted to each of these topics. They're kind of common sense, natural categories for organizing human motives and human emotions. The one thing that you will not see in some textbooks of evolutionary psychology is that last category, the life of the mind, meaning literature and the arts, religion, ideology, fantasy. The kind of evolutionary standpoint I represent, I sometimes call evolutionary humanism, meaning that has assimilated evolutionary psychology, evolutionary anthropology, but it insists that the imagination, the mind, is a crucial part of the human adaptive repertory, and that all of the other factors that go into human life, the kinds of things that psychologists and anthropologists focus on, like family or community, are intertwined in humans with the life of the mind. So I'm going to go through each of these categories one by one, say a little about how I would organize them, the topics, subtopics I would use in creating chapters on them in a book, and give examples from world literature of works that take each theme as a main concern. You'll notice that there's a fair amount of Chinese literature in here. I gave a version of this to a Chinese audience and decided to I intentionally put in a fair amount of references to Chinese literature just to have something they could immediately relate to, but then I have kept them in there because this is designed not to be specific to any one culture. It's not English or Anglo-American or European. It's meant to be world literature, cross-cultural, extending all the way from folk tales, oral narratives, ancient myths, up to contemporary literature. I'll start with survival. About as basic as anything can be. If you're in danger of your life, that takes priority over every other consideration. All other things become trivial in comparison. That's a little more difficult in our current life, in our current cultural situation, to be as aware as we could be about the importance of this, because we live so safely, securely, so well protected. But just before coming here today, I was talking to a friend whose uncle had just been killed in a car crash, and she was, deeply shaken, unexpected. Death impinges on all of us. If you're old enough, you'll almost certainly have lost people dear to you, and you'll be aware of how the death of a loved one can be one of the most significant emotional experiences of your life. So not only avoiding your own death or injury, not only finding food and shelter for yourself, but caring deeply about the physical well-being, the survival of your children or your spouse or even your parents or your friends. Envisioning death seems to be one of the first things that distinguishes modern humans as modern humans. Modern meaning anatomically modern about 200,000 years ago, but the term is more often used to mean culturally modern humans from somewhere between 100,000 and 40,000 years ago. People using complex multi-part tools, leaving behind paintings, statuary, ornamentation. And one of the features that distinguishes the modern human way of life is ceremonial burial, being aware of death and the significance of death, trying to understand it in relation to life as a whole, trying to envision what takes place after death. Almost every religion has some kind of vision of what happens to you after death. Coping with the prospect of extinction, terror management, trying to adjust your life and understand its meaning in the face of the fact that you're ultimately not going to be here in the not too distant future. So those are the kinds of themes, grieving for the dead, that are pervasive in literature. And I wrote an essay on violence in literature, and using this kind of model for human motives and taking examples. And though I'd been vaguely aware of the prevalence of death and violence in literature, it wasn't until I wrote this essay, big long survey essay, and realized that at least half of all the great works of the world involve some kind of violence and death. People are preoccupied with it. Hamlet, one of the signature works of our culture. If you think of Hamlet, you almost always iconically think of him holding Yorick's skull and meditating on death. Edgar Allan Poe, again, morbidly, neurotically obsessed with death, and as a result, capturing the imagination of generations of American and European readers. Dracula. I did a study with two psychologists and another literary scholar an empirical study of protagonists and antagonists in 19th century novels. We put 2,000 characters from 200 novels on a website and wrote to literary scholars and students all over the world and asked them to come fill out questionnaires on characters. Pick a character like David Copperfield or Jane Eyre and fill out a questionnaire telling us about her motives and emotions and personality characteristics, whether she's a protagonist or an antagonist, and how you respond emotionally. And so we asked, which character, how much fear does this character make you feel? And these are Likert scales, so 1, none at all, 7, a whole lot. And we were able to determine that the one character that scares people the most is Dracula. Jack London, To Build a Fire, a paradigmatic instance of just sheer realistic depiction of the intensity of the desire to live. And here are some other examples. The Seventh Day from Yu Hua, who's one of the best-selling current contemporary Chinese authors, beguilingly begins with a dead man walking along in a kind of dream landscape with his eye hanging out, and gradually realizing that he had just been killed in an explosion in a restaurant, and then spending the rest of the novel meeting all the dead people who populated his life. It's a way of coming to terms with the significance that people have in your life, while also coming to terms with your own death. If you're old enough, you'll probably know that even into relatively advanced middle age, you still have dreams of the dead people, your brothers or sisters or parents or grandparents who've been part of your life. So growing up, when I talk about the main phases of, main themes of human life history, I mean phases like growing up, old age. I also mean basic motives like survival, and also the kinds of social relationships that define us, that make us who we are. And growing up, what are some of the factors? Bonding with parents, probably few relationships, if any, in your life will be as intense as the relationship you had with your mother when you were 2, 3, 4 years old. Bonding and competing with siblings, squabbling, fighting, fussing, and yet the people with whom you remain closest in one way or another for the rest of your life. Playing and learning, developing a self-image, an identity, becoming a person, figuring out who you're going to be, and constructing a personal narrative. Part of the conceptual structure I'm using for this book absorbs work from Dan McAdams. He's a personality psychologist who's a founder of a field called narrative psychology. The idea is that one of the main things we do individually throughout our lives is construct a narrative identity. We're constantly telling ourselves and other people the story of ourselves, who we are, where we come from, what the main events of our lives have been. And that's part of the life of the mind. But as you can see, it's one of the things that pervades literature. I put Hamlet in here for everything because Hamlet's one of those works that takes in most of the major themes of human life. But many of the classic works of English literature, Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, Dickens' David Copperfield, are stories of growing up. Almost all the stories here are about children who are victimized in some way. They're orphans or they're abused and neglected. Literature tends not to tell simple, happy stories of well-adjusted people. It puts pressure on our greatest fears, anxieties, concerns, and worries. Harry Potter. My kids grew up during the Harry Potter phenomenon. You might remember, if you know anything about that whole series of books or the movies, Harry is a typical child protagonist. He's an orphan being raised by abusive relatives and trying to escape into his own community, his community of his peers. Sex and love. It's not just rock and roll. Sex and love forms I'd be interested in somebody doing an empirical study of just the sheer quantity of works that are involved with love stories. One of my fields of study is the Victorian novel, and I'd say that roughly on just an impressionistic count, 90% of them are love stories, stories of love and marriage, usually also involving inheritance. If you know anything about the psychology of romance, there's Robert Sternberg's a psychologist who has a scheme about love and marriage that's become widely accepted. It's just a simple analytic scheme, breaks it into three elements: passion, intimacy meaning companionship, warmth, closeness, and commitment, decisions to remain together. He calls all three of those together consummate love. And some intuitive understanding of that kind of norm is the norm against which love relationships are most typically compared in literature. Sex and love interact with and are often in conflict with life in the community. Romeo and Juliet, they love each other, but it just doesn't work socially. Infidelity and jealousy. If you experience romantic love, you're also going to experience the fear of losing it. Divorce and abandonment. Fidelity is meaning in life. I was talking earlier with Steve about value, biology and value. People will often say that, well, evolutionary psychologists, evolutionary social scientists will say that we have to make a distinction between is and ought, and that evolutionary social sciences can tell you how people behave and why they behave that way, but it can't tell you what you should value. I think that's less true than it seems on the surface. I think that the way we are, the way we've evolved to be, the nature that we have, sets real limits on the kind of values that can successfully be pursued in life. One of the things I plan to do in this book is to take a life history view, a systemic view of human life, all of its relationships, its commitments, its long-term requirements, and to use that as a rough evaluative measure for individual works. I'll be explicit, it's just my measure. Every individual can have his or her own value system, but I think there's a fairly general way of looking at meaning in life, and that it is framed by our biological nature. One of the things that many writers do is to take love and fidelity as the ultimate meaning in life, so that you can judge whether your life is a success or not in the degree to which you've been able to sustain the love relationships in your life. There's a recent TED talk about this 5 decades old longitudinal study. They took 500 men from Harvard and evaluated them every way they could, gave them physiological tests, medical tests, psychological tests, and then followed them for the rest of their lives and assessed the quality of their lives. And the conclusion that they came to was that the single most important factor in happiness, in making you happy, making you feel that your life has been good and rich and satisfying, is the degree to which you've been able to sustain long-term love relationships with friends, with family, with a spouse, with your children. So again, Romeo and Juliet, Hamlet, you don't think of it as a love story, but there's a broken love story in his relationship to Ophelia, and there is a love story, a degraded love story in the relationship between his uncle and his mother. Pride and Prejudice, we discovered in that empirical web-based study that Pride and Prejudice is the most popular novel. Elizabeth Bennet, at least among people who are willing to go fill out a questionnaire on Victorian novels, they're more interested in Elizabeth Bennet. And like all of Austen's novels, that's a love story. It's a marriage story. Later on in the century, serious literature tends to not end happily. Anna Karenina throws herself under a train. Madame Bovary swallows arsenic and dies. Family. There's an argument to be made that the single most important factor in the development of the human species as a species is the development of family, meaning pair-bonded dual parenting and multi-generational kin networks. Those are distinctive. There aren't any other primates that behave that way. Parents, children, siblings, and wider kin, family's a big term. It's a part of your individual identity. If you really can't get away from it, wherever you go, if you're having a conversation, eventually somebody's going to want to know where you come from. I was just listening to or watching the Bring Up the Bodies and Wolf Hall, the Hilary Mantel's historical novel about Henry VIII and his wives, and reminded me that there is a period in English history in which your parentage is one of the most decisive features in your personal identity. Intertwined love and conflict, families are terrible. You know, they're just, you can't get away from them. They're the source of much of the happiness and pleasure in your life, and they're endless sources of conflict and grief. The individual's intention with his family, the family's intention with society, but society and deity are modeled as family, God the Father, the Holy Mother. Oedipus Rex, at the very basis of our literary tradition, he makes a serious mistake with his family. Hamlet, they call that incest when the uncle marries his dead brother's wife, and all the worse because he murdered his brother in order to get her. King Lear, he gives all of his property to his daughters, and they betray and abandon him. Community. As I said, we're social animals. Finding a place in a social group, who am I? More often than not means what groups do I belong to? How am I valued in them? Am I respected? Am I admired? Am I despised? Am I a loner, an outcast? Who you are depends, your value as a person depends very heavily on how other people value you. There are two main principles at work in social life. One is dominance, hierarchy, being above or below, and then the other is affiliation, just bonding. So forming friendships, incorporating the group identity into your personal identity. Whenever you see somebody with an American flag on the lapel, they're trying to say that that's who I am as a person. Social ideology, we all have one. We're all, for the last several months, have been totally preoccupied with it. So far as I can tell from reading the New York Times and following social media, the social ideology has taken a forefront in deciding who we are as individuals and as a nation in a way that it hasn't since the Vietnam War. Hamlet, again, when he's meditating on life and death, he's also thinking about the basis of legitimacy and authority in political life. Balzac, the great French novelist, his 20-volume series is on society, the whole of society, all the classes of society. 1984, Lord of the Flies, you hit a mid-century period, and dystopia, the sheer malignant force of political ideology becomes a predominating concern. Aliens and enemies, we all belong to communities, and communities define themselves in part in contrast to other communities. There's a lot of individual violence within a community. I'm from St. Louis, and the other day I read we've had 150 murders in St. Louis so far this year. Group violence. Oh yeah, right. The big item in the news today, Las Vegas. Somebody taking a rifle and shooting hundreds of people. A friend I was talking to was in Sweden, and her uncle who died had been leaving a town where he had gone to join a group of people resisting a Nazi party rally. He was killed in a car wreck on the way home from, but that's Sweden. They didn't actually do what we did in Charlottesville. There wasn't any violence. They just stared at one another and said nasty things to each other. Betrayal and treachery, in-group and out-group. Henry VIII, again, reading about Henry VIII, betrayal and treachery. Fascinated by tyrants. I've read a lot about Mao and Stalin and Hitler. And one of the peculiar features of a tyrant is that almost everybody who gets near him is eventually destroyed by him, which was also the case with Henry VIII. Monsters, inhumans, subhumans, superhumans, popular culture, comic books, movies. Our whole culture now is saturated with the notion of strange creatures. Beowulf goes down and fights a monster. All Quiet on the Western Front, one of the shattering events in our modern cultural history. The War of the Worlds, Alien Species. And finally, the life of the mind. Every time we just sit and think quietly about other people, we're participating in the life of the mind. It's one of the big issues in evolutionary psychology. To what degree is just sitting and thinking adaptive? Is it just empty energy spinning off somewhere? That's an early way of evolutionary psychological thinking. The evidence is tilting very heavily in the other direction now. I was just reading recently about a whole body of research that's emerged in the last 10 or 15 years on something called the brain's default mode network. And it's a whole set of neurological areas, parts of the brain, that interact. And they discovered it by accident. It's default mode in that it's what the brain is doing when it isn't doing anything. In order to study what the brain is doing through neuroimaging, when it's task-oriented, when it's doing puzzles, figuring out sequences of numbers, they took a resting state measure and discovered that when the brain is resting, it isn't resting. It's using almost as much energy as it is when it's task-oriented. And what it's using is the default mode network, which keys into autobiographical memory, reflection on the past and the future, projection into the future, and perspective taking, being aware of the perspective of other people. It's what we call daydreaming. When we're not doing anything else, when we just let our minds relax, we slip into a daydream. And that daydream, as it turns out, is closely tied in with the creation of that autobiographical narrative that keeps us glued together, makes us an integrated, coherent personality. It's closely correlated also with dreaming. So dreams and fantasies, those are part of the life of the mind. Stories, poems, plays, songs, paintings, film, theology, philosophy, scholarship, and science. Hamlet, again, famously just a thinker, Hamlet the thinker, somebody who wonders about everything on heaven and earth. The Journey to the West, ancient Chinese text about Buddhism. The Magic Mountain, Thomas Mann. A young man goes up to a mountain resort, a clinic for tubercular patients, and spends several years just reading and thinking. And that's what the whole book is about, while he finds himself elevated into the adventure of the modern cultural imagination. So, my argument on the adaptive function of fictional narratives, what they're for, they give shape and meaning to human life. You'll probably have the experience that there are songs or stories or movies that are touchstones for you. They form a kind of permanent reference point in your mind, and you refer to them when something important happens, when you think about it in relation to those shaping narratives. You know, for many people, until fairly recently, the dominant shaping narrative was the Bible. That's what they read. That's what gave them their allegories, their parallels, their analogies, their metaphors, their names, their first names. My name is Joseph. My brother's name is Michael. It's the way we organize our imaginative experience of ourselves, our myths, and also even our literary fictions. So we create stories about our own lives. If you go out on a date, first date, you chat, you exchange little repartee, and then at a certain point, it's just inevitable. One of you is going to start telling your life story, and then it's the other person's turn. Every culture creates collective stories. They're myths of origin. I was talking to Steve about this on the way over here. Stories that explain how we as a people came to be, how the universe came to be, and what our meaning is within that world. We all create an imaginative virtual world. We don't live just in a physical world. The world we inhabit is a network of associations and memories, flickering remembrances of events and dreams and thoughts about what we're going to be doing in the future. So the stories that we read, the literary works that we read, they help create our imaginative virtual worlds. They feed into them. We imagine who we are. We create an identity for ourselves, and that gives us a goal. If you're a professor, you have an identity. You know that you are supposed to go in and do a certain kind of activity with your students. And you do that. That you adopt that identity, you assume that mantle, you take on that costume, that social persona, and then you perform those actions that are prescribed by the persona you've adopted. So you behave in accordance with what you think your role ought to be in the world you've imagined. Where do meaning and effect come from in stories? This is one of the most basic lessons that, as an English professor, I, over the decades, have come to emphasize in as many ways as possible with my students, that stories aren't just about what happens, but they're about what the people in the story feel and think about what happens. They're about what the author thinks about what happens, and they're about what you, as a reader, thinks about what happens. They come from your interpretation. The meaning comes from your interpretation. How the author feels about it, how you feel about what the author feels about it. So what do you interpret when you interpret a story? Well, there's you, there's the meaning and effect of the story, and the depicted action, what actually happens, that does matter. If you walk out of a movie with a friend and you run into another friend and they say, oh, I just saw this movie. And the friend will say, well, what was it about? And you say, well, it's about this guy and he robbed a bank and then the car broke down. And so you just start a plot summary. That matters. You can't have meaning unless there's something to have meaning about. And then there's the author. Henry James once said that the moral quality of a literary work is the quality of the mind of the person who produced it. You can take any set of plot points. I could do an experiment. I've done this in a class. And just give a basic set of plot items. 2 or 3 characters. They land on a desert island. There's not enough food. What do they do next? And have them all write the story. And every person will put a somewhat different spin on that story. For some people, it'll be comic or cynical. For some people, it'll be sadistic, psychopathic. For some people, it will be a story of love and heroism and triumphing over evil. So the way the author looks at it, the way the author treats it, that matters. The author imagines a reader. There's an ideal reader. There's a reader the author wants to communicate with. And you might or might not be that reader. I'm sure you've all seen a movie or read a novel, and you thought, that author wanted a reader who responded happily to the events in this story, and I'm not that guy. Or on the other hand, maybe you are. And then finally, in literary study, this is one of the main things you do as a student. You learn how to pull apart the mechanics, just the pieces of the story, how the characters are put together, how the time is organized, the spatial dimensions, who's narrating, how much summary there is, how much scenic dialogue. So all of that goes into what you do with the story. As a literary scholar, somebody determined to make sense out of stories, you have to look at them from some kind of set of concepts, some way of thinking what stories mean. So that's a literary theory. However rudimentary, however intuitive, unarticulated it might be, everybody has a theory. Nowadays, you have to have a theory. You can't get away without having a theory. If you went to a conference, if you went to a job interview and were being interviewed to be hired for a position as an English professor, one of the questions would be, what's your theory? So you have to make a choice, and that choice says who you are, your identity, your point of view, your attitudes, beliefs, feelings, tastes, needs, and interests, your knowledge about a given set of literary works, and then your theoretical ideas, what you believe literature is, how it works, what it means. Here are some of the options that are available these days if you're in literary study. Traditional humanism, this is what everybody did up until the 70s. You just, you read a lot, you absorb a lot of literature, you use your common sense, and you just make observations about literary text. People began to feel in the 70s that wasn't enough. You needed a theory. One of the main theories that came into place was Marxism, psychology, Freudianism. By default, just by lack of any other kind of psychological theory that had a grip on literature, Freudianism was and still remains the most widely used form of psychological theory for literature. Gender theory, probably somewhere between a quarter and a half of all literary study at the present time has some aspect of gender identity in it. Language theory, deconstruction. And then finally, the last new kid on the block, biology. People hadn't been thinking about this as an option until about 25 years ago. And I call it BioCultural Critique because one of the things you'll hear most often when you read a criticism of an evolutionary approach to literature is that it's reductive, meaning that it reduces the imagination and human experience to a few basic biological drives, like hunger, thirst, sex, desire for power, wealth. In fact, humans are biocultural. The peculiar feature of human evolution that made them different from other animals was that they developed the capacity to transmit information, technical and social information, and carry it on from generation to generation and let it accumulate. So gene-culture coevolution, the interaction of genes and culture, is the basis of biocultural theory. If you read any anthropological account of the evolution of Homo sapiens, the first thing they'll point out is walking on two legs, bipedalism, leaving your hands free, meaning that you get to use them for tools and eventually for fire and cooking. And those are technologies. They're not innate, genetic, anatomical, physiological. So that's culture. And some animals, like chimpanzees, have very simple forms of technology, but nothing even remotely approximating to the human capacity for cumulative innovation, for inventing things, keeping them, passing on, and adding to them. So that's biology, that's culture, and as soon as they start interacting, they form a feedback loop. They spiral. You get an enriched diet, bigger brains. You get the capacity for sharing attention, for social learning. It's one of the most prominent themes now in evolutionary social psychology. Humans have a unique capacity to think about the same thing at the same time and to coordinate their activity on the basis of shared abstract ideas. Humans needed that because surviving as a small, relatively weak bipedal ape in a world full of alpha predators required a lot of cooperation, hunting, gathering, taking care of children. Part of that whole feedback loop is the development of the family structure, lengthened childhood, and then you get cumulative culture. So complex tools become technology, internalized social norms become laws and ideologies, tribal organizations become institutions, and rudimentary forms of imagination become religion and the arts. The argument for a biocultural approach to literature is that it can encompass all the subject areas of other literary theories: socioeconomics, psychology, gender, language. It's comprehensive, but it's not merely pluralistic. It's not just pulling together a bunch of different things and using them in an ad hoc way. It is a scientific paradigm. Evolutionary biology itself is a scientific paradigm, and biocultural literary study or evolutionary humanism is an effort to extend and develop that paradigm by bringing into it all the subjects that are normally the subjects of the humanities. An argument in its favor is that it replaces obsolete speculative theories. Freudianism, Marxism, they're no longer active, predominating theories in their own fields, but they are in literary study. It takes socioeconomics and psychology and gender, and it puts the understanding of those on a sound scientific footing by assimilating the best current empirical information about them. This again is an answer to the question of reduction. There are 4 levels of critique in an analysis, biocultural analysis. There's human nature, and that's what, if you read a criticism, a hostile criticism of evolutionary literary study, when they say that it's reductive, they mean it reduces to just the basics of biology. But a biocultural critique takes in specific cultures. It takes in the individuality of the artist and the reader, and it looks at a particular work of art and the way it's put together. Human nature, motives, emotions. Again, one of the main things that forms my research program is the belief that human life history theory, which is a specialized area of anthropological, biological theory, forms an adequate basis for understanding the main motives and social relationships and phases of human life, that those are the main basic themes. But then every culture changes those themes, interprets them in different ways, organizes them in different ways. Tribal cultures, historical periods. So you finally get down to the individual work of art, and you've tried to contextualize it in relation to the mind of the author, everything the author wrote or did or thought or felt. So there's a heavy orientation towards biopsychological criticism. But you've also looked at what's called cultural studies. You've absorbed as much as you can about the religion and the politics and the economics and the ecology of the society that the author lived in. But you take all of that and you put it in the broader context of a shared universal human nature, a species-typical cross-cultural set of motives and emotions. Basic human motives are channeled into specific cultural norms. Specific cultural norms are articulated in imaginative form through myths, legends, rituals, images, songs, and stories. And humans universally regulate their behavior in accordance with beliefs and values that are made vividly present to them in the arts. So biocultural critics aim at trying to do everything, basically. I remember standing at the mailboxes in my office, the English department in my university one day, talking with a colleague about it. And she asked me sort of mockingly, well, do you think critics should have to do everything? And I thought about it and said, yeah, I kind of do, actually. You have to be able to do, you have to be able to talk about any literary work, no matter how narrow your specialty is, you really have to be able to take in the whole of human experience. So you do the normal kind of analytic work, analyzing thematic, tonal, and formal structures. You look at the cultural history. You explain the cultural context by locating it in human nature. You talk about the responses of readers. You talk about the kind of works, the kind of functions the works fulfill, the kind of work they do in their culture and for the mind of their author and their readers. You locate all of that in the basic needs of human nature. And then finally, you try to organize it as a total system in relation to all literary works. So what biocultural critics are trying to do is to give a true and comprehensive understanding of literature. I should probably say that, just to give you a sense of the demographics, that I did a survey, reread everything in the field last year, and counted to see how many people were doing it. And there were about 30 books and 300 or 400 articles, depending on where you set the boundaries. So it's a fairly small body of people doing this kind of work, but substantial enough so that it has a distinct profile. Substantial enough so that it's been profiled in the New York Times, in the journals Science and Nature, and has been attacked fairly prominently in places like Critical Inquiry, flagship theoretical journal in academic literary studies. So biocultural critics are aiming at giving a true and comprehensive understanding of literature, and they're also aiming at incorporating literary knowledge within a comprehensive, empirically grounded biocultural understanding of all human behavior and all human experience. One of the things I noticed in reading back through all of the works was that after 1998, when E.O. Wilson published a book called Consilience, The Unity of Knowledge, almost everybody working in this area, evolutionary literary studies and evolutionary aesthetics, a related field, referenced Wilson's book. Consilience is an old word. It just means knowledge coming together. And that's a survey. Wilson's book is a survey. He's a famous biologist. It's a survey of all the fields of knowledge, trying to summarize them, and arguing that they're all ultimately unified, that nature itself is a unified causal structure so far as we know, and that science, including the sciences, the social sciences, and including the humanities, should be a single, total, unified, interconnected, explanatory network. And that program, that ideal, is actively the ideal of almost all the people working in this field. So, thank you.
I have a question about this, sort of the big thesis that we're supposed to understand, a comprehensive theory of literature. So, what exactly is the theory? Is it a causal theory about why we write the stories we do?
Well, that's part of it, yeah. It is. It does contain a causal theory, yeah. I mean,
So,
there's a theory about the adaptive function, which is a theory of cause.
So the causal story is something like, well, it's an adaptive story. You see, there's all sorts of different kinds of stories we could tell, and people who told certain kinds of stories, in fact, survived better. So then what do you mean by an adaptive story?
No, that was the argument or the discussion that Steve and I were having. Is it one kind of story adaptive or another kind of story adaptive? My argument is that it's just the storytelling impulse itself that's adaptive. That this is actually Wilson's theory in Concilians. I adopted it and developed it. The idea that humans are different in a crucial way from animals of other species. We are less constrained by instinct. We have instincts, we have impulses, survival instincts, mating, sex instincts, fear of death, love of community. But our behavior is demonstrably much more flexible. For other animals, the world presents a series of stimuli. And, the kind of information that can come in is relatively limited. And it's channeled into a fairly tight array of reactive responses. You get flight or flight, you get hunting impulses, you get mating impulses. In humans, those impulses are there, but they are organized and often suppressed and modified by cultural configurations. Marriage, for example, is a human universal. Every known culture has some form of officially recognized exclusive rights of sexual interaction and responsibilities that go with that. But types of marriage vary from polygamy to monogamy to serial monogamy. There are all kinds of rules and regulations. Humans can take whatever set of basic biological impulses we've got and can organize them in multiple different ways. There's a risk to that, the risk being that you can easily get disorganized. Well, the argument is that the imagination, the cultural imagination, of which literature is only one part, is a way of taking our greater flexibility, which is our most important adaptive power, and keeping it under control. Myths, religions, ideologies, these are ways in which we shape our values and our behavior. And literature just feeds into that. Are some stories adaptive or maladaptive? That's been debated a lot. Is pornography adaptive or maladaptive? Or is it just a kind of way of exploiting evolved dispositions for fun, like taking drugs or drinking alcohol or eating rich foods?
But I would have thought, so if you think about, like, I don't know if it was your first slide, but really early on, you had a slide about these other big literary theories we're talking about, race and gender or Marxism and whatever. And, I took the biocultural thing to be, in some sense, a competitor to those ways of thinking about literature. But they're not asking the question, why do we tell stories? Right? They're just doing a very different thing. That's a way that we're supposed to interpret the stories.
They are saying how you're supposed to interpret a story, but there's often a functional explanation behind there too. We tell, from a Foucauldian perspective, a quasi-Marxist perspective, we tell stories in order to impose an ideology, and it's an ideology that's ultimately regulated by the people, the elites who hold power. And we adopt those stories on our reconcile ourselves to power. Or from a gender angle, we tell stories in order to enforce a certain kind of patriarchal ethos. Or from a Freudian angle, we tell stories in order to disguise the subconscious impulses that we're not able to acknowledge consciously. So there's all the theories have some kind of a component of causal explanation, while also setting up a set of categories, descriptive categories, that preemptively tell you what to look for. Every literary theory presupposes that the categories it's using are the actual categories that regulate stories. That those are the main categories. So if you read a Marxist critique of a novel, you're going to read about class consciousness. And class consciousness is going to be a primary shaping force in the organization of the story. In those respects, as explanatory, descriptive, and analytic theories, the biocultural theory is equivalent to all the other theories. It does the same kind of thing. It claims to have a greater legitimacy on the grounds that it draws its information, its categories, from an established scientific paradigm, evolutionary biology, and a whole vast research community, empirical research community, the evolutionary social sciences. Yes.
I think there is a slight difference between biological adaptations and cultural adaptations. You know, cultural adaptation is sort of, it's in one life. You have to tell the story to your children so that it will be continued. You know, it is not a heritable characteristics. And so this is why storytelling, religion, it has to be told and retold, and that way it can transmit.
Yeah.
But biological adaptation, you see, if there is any breakthrough. For example, if dinosaurs learn how to fly.
Right.
And then that flight will be transmitted, easily to their offspring. But cultural adaptive doesn't, unless you are grown in that.
Right. No, there is a real basic distinction there. Other animals adapt anatomically, physically. They grow longer fur, or they longer legs, or longer neck, or they get smaller. Culture is itself an adaptation. The specific kinds of culture are, as you say, they're local, ad hoc. If you're adapting to a certain kind of climate by the kind of clothes you wear, that's, or if you're telling a certain kind of story to support your idea about your social group, that can be transmitted. It has to be transmitted. It's not built in as a genetically mediated, genetically transmitted characteristic. But the power of culture itself is genetically transmitted. Humans, I was at the Human Behavior and Evolution Society conference this past summer. That's the organization of the evolutionary social scientists in multiple fields, anthropology and psychology and archaeology and neuroscience. And the keynote address was given by Michael Tomasello, who's been one of the most important theoretical people in the past 10, 15 years. And his whole body of research, he studies cognition in chimpanzees and human infants. He's a cognitive, comparative, developmental psychologist. And his research is focused on the peculiarly human powers of social learning, imitation, collective learning, shared attention is one of his main ideas. It was a fascinating study. He gave all kinds of little experiments with chimpanzees and babies, showing that humans at a very early age begin to develop the capacity for culture, for learning from other people and transmitting that in a way that no other species does. There's evolved cognitive mechanisms that are genetic. They're just built into the machinery They're physiological, they're anatomical, they're neurological, and they are the basis for our power of culture. But then specific cultural adaptations, as you say, those are learned and transmitted individually. They're not built in. A distinction that's often made is language. Humans have an innate capacity for language, but the language that you learn, Japanese, Chinese, Hindi, whatever it might be, depends on where you live. So yes.
In your outline of the cycle of human life, how do you accommodate the philosophical concept or the religious belief of reincarnation?
Well, as I said in talking about death, one of the themes that preoccupies people all over the world, and apparently always has since the beginning of modern humanity, is death. What happens after death? And I take reincarnation as just yet another instance of the effort to imagine some kind of ultimate existence after death. I mean, you don't reincarnate indefinitely. You're ultimately aiming at getting out of that cycle. The ultimate stage is to leave the cycle of life and to enter into nirvana and ultimate bliss, a state of release. In a way, it's a parallel to a Christian conception of an afterlife. Yeah, when I talk about the human life cycle, I mean what actually happens. And the cultural imagination can imagine it differently, and often does. Unless you believe in the Christian mythology, unless you believe in heaven or hell, you have to accept the fact that while you're reading Paradise Lost, Milton's Paradise Lost, you're dealing with a cosmology that's different from your own cosmology. So you can't say that Milton believed that the human life cycle told the whole story about human life. For him it didn't. You can nonetheless talk about the ways in which the human life cycle shapes Milton's emotions, his motives, including his anxiety about death, his patriarchal conceptions, his conception of the God the Father, the family figure, his understanding of evil. There probably aren't that many writers, imaginative writers, who clearly have adopted a Darwinian evolutionary understanding of life. There are a few, you can identify a few who are overt Darwinians. But, some people are Marxists, some people are Freudians, a lot of people are Christians. Many people have their own idiosyncratic belief systems. Yu Hua, this author I was talking about, Chinese author, keeps reimagining life after death over and over again in various forms. China is officially an atheist country. I mean, that's the official policy. In fact, I think it's illegal even to preach anything other than that. But the desire to imagine life after death seems to be just an irrepressible human need. My own personal vision, if you can call it that, is nothing. I mean, what happens after death is just like nothing. There's nothing there. It's empty. But that's just my personal vision. Everybody's got one. I would never argue that an evolutionary perspective is that you can only use an evolutionary perspective to look at other people who believe in evolution. The idea is that gives you an encompassing explanatory framework, but within that you have to understand that everybody has their own belief systems. is it possible to talk about Christian literature from, or the literature of reincarnation from an evolutionary perspective? Yes, I think it is.